Prabhupada's birth anniversary, which, I don't know, it's almost like designed. Janmashtami is our biggest celebration of the year, and it was yesterday. And part of the program is you got to stay up until midnight, and then there's a festival that takes place at midnight, which means I got to bed about 3:30 in the morning, and then the next day there's festival number 2, and that was just earlier today, and then there's tonight, and then we got another festival tomorrow. Somehow it's like a ultra marathon weekend for us. I think a lot of people pick and choose what they go to. So maybe they hit last night and then they're off for the rest of the weekend, or they go to something, yesterday and today, and then they don't come tonight. But I don't have that luxury. I got to show up for everything. And so, unlike a lot of you part-timers, I got to show up at everything. And it's an austerity. It's some work. I was thinking about what to talk about, and I was reminded of when Prabhupada first came to the West, before he had any followers, just at the very beginning. Yeah. Prabhupada's sojourn to the West, his trip from India to the West, it's like a real hero's journey. He met his guru in 1922, and on the first day they met, the first thing he was told was, you should go to the West and share our teachings with the rest of the world in English. And that instruction, that request, that instruction, it took Prabhupada 43 years to accomplish it. So he was 26 when he heard this, and by the time he did it, he was 69. And most of us don't know this, but there were a bunch of Indian immigrants to the U.S. in the late 1800s. The logging industry in the Pacific Northwest needed cheap labor, and Indians, North Indians, Sikhs and Punjabis and Pathans, which is the Indian name for Pashtuns, they came over, and they were bigger than the Chinese immigrants who had worked on the railroads, who were discriminated against all through the 1800s as well. There were actually laws passed, federal laws passed against Chinese immigrants who were born in the U.S. being allowed to become U.S. citizens. It's the only time tonight that's ever been done. Post-bellum, since slavery was ended. It's the only time that we ever denied people who were born in this country citizenship. It was towards Chinese immigrants. It's like a lot of hatred towards the Chinese immigrants by the Irish, who themselves were immigrants, but who gotten here a little bit earlier. And so they had, if you get here a little earlier, then it's your country, and then you're bigoted against whoever comes after you. So anyway, the Indians came. They were a little hardier, and they worked in logging, and it upset the white people who were involved in the logging industry. And so they passed an Immigration Act against Indians being able to come to the U.S. And so, now in the U.S., there's 3 million Indians in the U.S. Roughly 1% of the U.S. population is from India. But between 1900 and 1965, there are only about 15,000 Indians in the U.S. at any one given time. So that means 1/200th, less than 0.5% of what we have now. Super small number, around 0.5%, a little over 0.5% of what we have now. And so Prabhupada couldn't get into the U.S. He was told to come to the West to go, and so he wanted to go to the U.S., which was the capital of the world at that point, taken over from the England. Post-World War II, England stopped being capital of the world, and the U.S. was really the place to go. And so he was 26 when he was told to do this. He was 69 by the time he finally got around to doing it. And that was largely because you just simply could not get a visa from India to the U.S. unless you were, some kind of super specialized labor, and there was no other way to get it done without you. So in 1965, they repealed this Immigration Act, and you had huge droves of Indians coming into the U.S., and Prabhupada was part of that first wave. And he didn't even get over here on a plane, and plane travel was the norm in the 60s. And people still travel by trains, but certainly internationally people travel by planes. But Prabhupada traveled by boat. And there's a reason for that too. He had no money. So he came over on a boat. And the boat he came over on wasn't a passenger ship, a cruise ship. It was a cargo ship. And Prabhupada happened to know somebody, a pious Hindu lady, Sumati Morarji, who owned a shipping company. And he convinced her to give him passage. She thought she'd get out of it. She said, if you get a visa, then I'll give you passage. But then the Immigration Act got repealed. He got a visa, and then she was obliged to keep her commitment. And so Prabhupada came over on a cargo ship. It was a 40-day journey. In August and September of 1965. In fact, whatever, that was 57 years ago, Prabhupada was on a cargo ship at this exact time. He celebrated his birthday alone on the cargo ship. So with Prabhupada, you get the story of somebody who, as a young man, was given this instruction by his teacher on their first meeting, took it to heart, and spent the next 4 decades of his life learning English, publishing books in English at a time when that was almost not done, getting a visa, practically stowing away on a cargo ship like out of a movie or something like that. There's a whole hobo culture. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this, but there's a whole hobo culture in the U.S. where people travel on trains. And they jump on trains, and they get around, they travel on trains, and it's a whole subculture. And there's a book about it, and you can still do it. And there's certain places that you never go to because they're really fierce about checking the train, certain hubs in the Midwest. It's escaping me which ones they are. But I want to say Madison, Wisconsin is a big hub, but I can't exactly remember. But there's certain places you avoid like the plague, but there's a whole subculture. So Prabhupada almost was like a hobo in the sense that he got on a cargo ship. Who does that? Nobody rides on freight trains or cargo ships. It's unheard of. In fact, I've never heard of anybody besides hobos, like in a movie, somebody escaping, stowing away on a cargo ship or on a freight train. And at least on a freight train, you can get off. You're not on there for 40 days straight. Anyway, Prabhupada had 2 heart attacks on the boat. He wrote some beautiful poetry in Bengali that he never thought would be published in English, but we now have it. We got the poetry and we published it posthumously after he passed away. But he, so anyways, it's a whole hero's journey. But another remarkable feature of that hero's journey is that Prabhupada had a real vision. The same way you need to figure out your why, and then you can figure out your hows and your whats, and you got to figure out what you stand for and what your purpose is. And once you figure out what your purpose is, you can then sculpt your life and curate your life. Like, for instance, give me a really mundane business. Like, what's the most mundane business you can think of?
Paper supplier.
Huh?
Paper supplier.
Paper supplier, right? Right? We help the world to communicate. You follow? There's a why in there. Paper supplier, like the office, the epitome of dead-end, useless jobs. I think they picked the office because paper's a dying industry, so they're working in a dying industry. Everything is done electronic. I never thought of this until just now, but obviously they did this purposefully. So everybody was depressed, sales sucked, everything was going downhill because you live in right? We help the world to communicate elegantly. How about that one? You follow? We preserve the art of writing. We help to keep alive the art of penmanship. We help the world to communicate concretely. When you know your why, it's very powerful and you get motivated. And so this idea of taking your job or taking what you're doing in school or even your family or your hobbies and connecting them to a bigger purpose of how you contribute, how you make the world a better place, how you uplift. It's powerful because it gives you inspiration. And then your reason for existence is more than just getting a paycheck. You're contributing, you're doing something, you're adding something to the world. So, Prabhupada, despite having no formal education in strategic planning and not having this kind of background, he was a very strategic thinker. And while he was transplanting a spiritual tradition to a foreign soil, it's also, it's also kind of inconceivable. India was ruled. The bloodiest genocide in the history of the world was the Islamic occupation of India. 100 million Hindus were killed over a 1,000-year period, starting in the 8th century through the 18th century, when Islam ceded control of India to the Dutch East India Company, British East India Company, and England took over. England took over India. And so India was ruled for a solid 12, 13 centuries by foreign invaders who literally raped the country and the people and committed the at least as far as the Islamic rulers go, it was the bloodiest genocide the world's ever known. Multiply Hitler times 10. Multiply Stalin times 5. Multiply Mao times 5. Or times 2.5. There was also this thing called the Great Leap Forward, where Mao tried to centralize grain production and blew it, and 20 million people died. They rebranded it as the Great Leap Forward, as they call it. You guys can Google it. But it's a super clever euphemism for we killed 20 million of our people. Yeah, I'm just, it was so bad. And so India was just beaten senseless by the Middle East and by the West. But Prabhupada was coming an ambassador, a cultural, spiritual ambassador to, and then of course about 10% of the Indian population is currently Muslim, and there's a reason for that. I mean, some people obviously would have converted because they like their religion, but it's hard to know that. Just like some people might sleep with their kidnappers consensually, but legally we don't really consider that because the very act of kidnapping seems to mitigate against free will and create a hegemony and a dominance and a disparateness of power. So even if a prisoner sleeps with their guards consensually, or a child with an adult, when there's too large of a power differential, we say that they actually don't have the freedom to make a choice. And so about 10% of the current Indian population is Muslim, but they had to pay a tax to be Hindu. And so if you were too poor to pay the tax, kind of your only choice was to convert to Islam. Otherwise, you'd get thrown in debtor's prison. You had to pay the jizya, which was a tax. If you were a non-Muslim living in a Muslim world country, you had to pay a tax for practicing your religion. There's a bunch of other things. It was a real second-class, dhimmi servant class, second-class citizen without rights. And so that's what Islam did whenever they took over a country. That's Sharia. That everybody else except for Muslims is a second-class citizen, is subjugated, and has a significant attenuation of their civil rights. Islam ruled India, and they converted all their people. They converted people. They made it really painful to be a Hindu. Then the British came, and they, Protestant Christians, just went to town with India for centuries trying to convert people. Catholics had their go. Spain, Portugal, specifically the Portuguese, they came and settled in South India through trade, and they preached Catholicism. You find a bunch of churches in Kerala, the lower western seaboard, kind of like Baja California, but in India, that lower western seaboard. So India was being, people were coming in and forcing their traditions on the native people in a variety of ways, and pressuring them financially, physically. But Prabhupada was coming as an ambassador to share the wisdom of ancient India with the West. So it was, it's the same kind of thing. It's like this. It's like the dying industry of paper, and being on a cargo ship. They're all sort of anachronistic things. It's not what you want to be in. You want to be in that dying business. You want to be on that cargo ship. And so Prabhupada also was really swimming upstream by coming to the West to share Indian culture when India was considered to be a subjugated nation. People weren't as likely to want to hear what they had to say. But anyway, he did that, and he was a real strategic thinker. And before he had any followers, he was thinking about what was his purpose, and he was strategically planning, and he came up with a mission statement, which is what huge corporations do. Like if you look at what's one of the nicest hotels in the world? The Ritz-Carlton. The Ritz-Carlton's mission statement is, "We are ladies and gentlemen serving ladies and gentlemen," which is actually a nice mission statement because it indicates that just being in the hotel hospitality industry doesn't mean that the people you're serving get to treat you poorly. we're ladies and gentlemen, and we're serving ladies and gentlemen. There's an equality there because we're human beings and we're serving human beings, and so you don't get to treat us like second-class citizens. So the Ritz-Carlton wove into their mission statement some sense of self-respect for their employees. It's actually nice. This is killing me. I don't know what the deal is. I'm just going to keep trying. We could buy one that actually works. It would be a pretty cool thing. So Prabhupada came up with a mission statement. And I want to read to you from his mission statement. To systematically propagate spiritual knowledge to society at large and to educate all people in the techniques of spiritual life in order to check the imbalance of values in life and to achieve real unity and peace in the world. Let me just read that again. To systematically propagate spiritual knowledge to society at large and to educate all people in the techniques of spiritual life in order to check the imbalance of values in life and to achieve real unity and peace in the world. These are big ideas. Prabhupada was a big thinker on that cargo ship. Big thinker all alone with no followers. A big thinker as a cultural ambassador from India to the U.S. at a time when people in the U.S. weren't really listening. On a cargo ship with no money. These are big ideas. Number one, that spirituality should be systematically shared. And that it's technical. It's not just, do what you want to do. There's a technical side to it. And he was in possession of that technical knowledge. And that the result of that would be it would correct an imbalance in people's lives where they were rushing like moths into flames for material enjoyment and ignoring the deeper purpose of life. To propagate a consciousness of Krishna as it is revealed in the great scriptures of India. To propagate a consciousness of Krishna. That's where you get the word Krishna consciousness from. And this is before all of, like we have things like Krishna, the Supreme Personality of God. We have ideas like this. They were in an incipient stage here. You find Prabhupada saying the personality of God. The Supreme Person. He's using language like that because hasn't quite codified fully the way he wants to communicate his teaching. So you're really seeing Prabhupada formulating his language that he was going to eventually become a standard lexicon that we all learn. Listen to this one. This is what I want to focus on. To bring the members of society together with each other and nearer to Krishna, the prime entity. There's more, but I'm going to break the sentence in half. To bring the members of the society, so he wants to create a society within a society, and then he wants to bring them close together so they can spend time together and get closer to one another, almost like you would find in any social group. But then simultaneously they can get closer to Krishna, the prime entity. I thought that was a very sexy term to use for God, the prime entity. It communicates that God is a person as much as we're a person, but that God is distinct from us and that God is the prime personality. Krishna is the supreme being, the original being, the being from whom all other beings derive. It's a really sophisticated understanding. It really packs a wallop. Thus developing the idea within the members. So this is a continuation of the sentence. Thus developing the idea within the members and humanity at large, because he's thinking big, that each soul is part and parcel of the quality of Godhead. Godhead is a archaic English term. It's not really used by anybody anymore. It means God as a being. It oftentimes refers to the Trinity, but it means God as a concrete being, someone you could actually love, not a vague, indefinite force. And so developing the idea within the members and humanity at large that each soul is part and parcel of the quality of Godhead. It's almost like so dense that you can't really understand it with one or two or even three readings. It's an extremely pregnant, dense statement. And I wanted to look at this just a little bit today. The idea that Prabhupada wanted to share was, as people came together and developed some friendship and some community, that wouldn't replace them getting together with their source, with their maker, with Krishna. So simultaneously, you want to have some kind of social dynamic and satisfy yourself on a social level with finding people that you have things in common with. But instead of that getting in the way of or acting as a surrogate for a connection with divinity, instead the group would foster that connection with divinity. And so you would get two things for the price of one. Instead of being part of a group that takes you away from the ultimate purpose of life, you'd be part of a group that helped to foster and bring you closer to the ultimate goal of life. Did you follow that? Normally our social lives are a distraction. And then our spiritual life becomes something else. Even like if you go to like a Catholic mixer or something like that, that's a distraction. It just happens to be done at a church. But to have a social gathering which wasn't based on exploitation or enjoyment, and it was solely based on bringing everybody closer to divinity, it's a radical idea. I don't think we're the only ones to ever have this idea. I don't think there are other traditions don't do the same thing. This isn't meant to indicate exclusivism, but it's really a good spiritual tradition. C.S. Lewis, the guy who wrote the book The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, a whole series of books that got made into movies, in the last few decades. He wrote a book called Mere Christianity in the 40s. Mere Christianity. And the theme of the book was that I'm tired of meeting Christian industrialists or Christian philanthropists or Christian business people or Christian artists. When will I meet somebody who is merely Christian? They're not something else, and then Christian just becomes an adjective which modifies what they do. But that's actually who they are. They're mere Christians. That's the most important thing to them. That's their identity. So this critique of how a tradition will get mission drift, like the Salvation Army, who in this country is synonymous with free clothing. Oh, we get these calls all the time at our temple. Do you accept old saris? And I'm like, no, we don't. I'm sorry. And people are offended. Like somehow or other as a church, we are obliged to be involved in the distribution of used clothing. Like that's like being a church means you're a vintage clothing store. Like somehow that's like the gig. Or sometimes homeless people will come to the temple and they'll say, can you give me money? And they're like, no, we can't give you money. And they're like, well, how about some blankets? I'm like, no, sorry, we don't do that either. And they're like, well, what are you here for? Well, we're here because we're like a church and we do spiritual stuff. But there's this idea that churches primarily exist as halfway houses or to feed the poor. I don't think that's a bad idea. I don't think it's a bad idea that nonprofits get in on that action. I don't think it's wrong. But I always found it to be a little strange when people just assume that if you don't do that, what are you doing? That's what you're good for. Because there are institutions that specialize in feeding homeless people or giving them blankets. They're designated as such. You can find them in the yellow pages. But why do we have to be that? Why are we competing with them? We don't want to take their market share. They got that thing dialed in. They got it all figured out. We don't want to get in their way. And so the Salvation Army originally was a super radical group of Protestant Christians that were militant. That's why there was a Salvation Army. Instead of a priest, you became a captain or a general, and they had different ranks. And then they would go out and they would do kirtan in the streets, Christian kirtan. They would stand out in the streets with musical instruments and they would sing. That was their thing. They stopped doing it. Their kirtan program didn't work out. It wasn't popular. And somehow they got into giving people clothing, and that became them. And now the Salvation Army is synonymous with clothing stores, which is a huge mission drift for the people who framed it out. They wanted to spread, love for Jesus. They didn't want to start a used clothing store. But this happens. People, they drift away and they drift into other stuff. Sometimes the other stuff is valuable. Maybe the other stuff is even more valuable. But a lot of times the drift means it happens without your conscious awareness, and you sort of just flow into something, and pretty soon you're looking around and you're thinking, I don't even recognize this anymore. Anyway, so you see here from Prabhupada something you find in like many revivalists and reformers and real like serious thinkers, which was a way to figure out how to move forward in the world, interact with the world, and not lose your heart, not lose your purpose, to really keep that strong within you. And then what was that message he wanted to give? Because we want to bring them closer to Krishna. How do you bring them closer to Krishna? You help people have the idea that they are part and parcel of the quality of the Godhead. It's a super awkward statement in English. First of all, part and parcel, what does that even mean? What's a parcel? When you think parcel, what do you think of? UPS. You guys have who didn't think of UPS when I said parcel? You didn't think of UPS?
I did.
You did. Who did not think of UPS? You didn't think of UPS? What did you think of?
I thought about like the desert and how they have different parcels.
That's cool. What about you? Same thing. Some kind of weird thing. You guys are into desert parcels? A parcel of land. Yeah. It's not just in the desert. They have parcels of land all over the place. Yeah, a parcel is a discrete unit. And what's a part? A part is not a discrete unit. And so when you say part and parcel, you're indicating that we are both simultaneously one with God and distinct from God. Part and parcel. We are part of, one with, and we are parcel. We are distinct and discrete and our own individual self as well. You get some kind of an understanding of this mix when you look at the United States of America. How come it's just not the United Country of America? How come it's not just United America? Because the states still have a significant degree of autonomy. And so the states have their own individual identity. They are equal to one another, but they are not one and the same. They have different laws. And then you have a federal government which houses all 50 states and some of the outlying territories. And they unite them together under one constitution with one army. There's many ways in which we are one. You get taxed at the state level, you get taxed at the federal level. But we don't have state armies. We have one federal army. We have one, I guess not a federal army. I guess that'd be the National Guard. But we have, one military wing. Each state doesn't have their own military. And so the United States is a group of individual states, because the 13 colonies were originally their own thing. Then they grouped together, but they didn't want to just get mashed into one. They wanted to retain some of their original flavor and some of their original governance. Part and parcel. So how are we part of Krishna, according to Prabhupada? We are one in quality. We are eternal divine beings. How are we distinct? We are not the original being. We're not the prime being. We're not the creator. We're not the origin of all. This is a verse from the Upanishads. Nityo nityanam chaitanas chaitananam. From the one eternal come many eternals. From the one conscious come many conscious beings. And so, how are we distinct from Krishna? We're not the origin of the universe. How are we one with Krishna? We're qualitatively a spark of the divine. Like like a photon. A photon is a microscopic, tiny part of the sun. But a photon isn't the actual sun itself, it's the energy of the sun. It communicates the heat and light of the sun, but itself is simultaneously an individual unit. It's a photon, it's not the whole sun. Or like an ember, it's part of a fire. But it's not actually the fire itself, it's a part of the fire. It's got heat, it's got light, it's part of the fire, but it also has its own individual existence as an ember. This statement comes from one of our core texts. There's a verse, a super famous verse. Jiver, the jivas, the souls, swarup, the soul's original position. Krishna Nityadas is to be Krishna's servant. The soul's original position is to be Krishna's servant. That means that when you strip away whether you're male or female or black or white or fat or thin or young or old or human or animal, every living entity, ultimately, if you dig deep enough and scrape away all that you are not, you'll be left with what you are, and what you are is eternally connected to Krishna in a relationship of service. There's a prime entity, and then there's these derivative entities. We are these derivative entities, and we are connected to our Creator. And that connection for us is through bhakti, through devotion, through loving service, voluntary service. Then that extends to all of Krishna's creatures. And so if you love Krishna, then automatically you're going to love all of Krishna's creatures. And this is how Prabhupada was thinking he would be able to create unity in the world. Because if you understand this, that I'm a part and parcel of Krishna, and I'm Krishna's eternal servant, and so is everybody else, then you can't exploit people. Because you see that they have a higher purpose that's bigger than you. And then your love for Krishna is manifested in the way you treat them. And so Prabhupada had this idea. He was going to save the world through this. He thought this was a very powerful teaching. And what he wrote, although he wrote it there was his own writing in English, it wasn't really just his own writing because he was translating this idea. Jiver Swarupoi Krishna Nityadas. Jiva has a fundamental ontological existence that's universal, which is that all souls are Krishna's servants. And then Krishna Tatasta Shakti Beda Bed Prakash. That this energy of souls is Bed Abhed Prakash. It's a Prakash, which is a manifestation, which is Bed, different from Krishna, and Abhed, not different from Krishna. Now if you were to translate Bed and Abhed, which means different and not different, what would be a good translation of that? Part and parcel. And so you've got Prabhupada here building on some really ancient ideas, some beautiful ideas, some of these amazing ideas that Indic spirituality has to contribute to the world in its own unique language and with its own unique flair. Not that we're the only people in the world to ever come up with this, but with its own unique flair. And actually the verse continues. The next verse is Suryang Sakiran, like a ray of the sun. Agni Jwala Chai, Yaiche Agni Jwala Chai, like an ember in a fire. And so even these analogies that I gave you, they're very old analogies which are given to communicate this idea so we can start to think about it. And I think this idea is dangerous and powerful, and even you could say seductive. Seductive in the sense of it's incredibly attractive, so much so that it intrigues you. And it's dangerous, and it's very challenging to the way most people think about the world. And it's powerful because, and you can just think about this for a second. Imagine for a moment that you realized concretely, I am a part and parcel of Krishna. Forever, I'm connected to Krishna. I am a divine spark. That is my eternal identity. This body I'm occupying is just for a minute, but my eternal identity is as an ember to a fire, a ray of sun to the sunshine. Fundamentally, I am a pure, eternal, living entity, soul, part of God. How would that change your life? How would that change your life? Would you be out there making money the most important thing in your life? Would you be out there making sex the most important thing in your life? If you had the concomitant realization that everybody else was also Krishna's eternal soul, would you feel connected to everybody you met? Would you be able to exploit them? These ideas are dangerous because they really challenge materialism in all of its iterations and pernicious and sneaky manifestations in people's lives. And it's attractive to the point of being seductive because it's an idea which is so powerful and attractive that it can in many ways trump and replace all other ideas about what the purpose of life is. In fact, I mean, we're helping the world to communicate elegantly. We're keeping the lost art of penmanship alive. What idea is more broad and deep and beautiful and profound and attractive? What idea is bigger than you're eternally connected to divinity, and so is everybody else? Just because it's dealing with eternal things, automatically nothing material can trump it. Saving suffering kids in South America, or Africa, or India, or the East, wherever, you can't trump it. I mean, that certainly is a powerful idea to save children and feed them. But you're feeding a body. I mean, we're talking about somebody's eternal existence. That couldn't possibly be just simply because I'm talking about something which is forever, a forever idea. I gave up. Simply because I'm talking about a forever idea, it automatically beats every material idea you could ever come up with, no matter how philanthropic. Did you follow that? It's a challenge even to activism and philanthropy. Mundane activism and philanthropy. Because if you take a poor person and you make them win the lottery, if they have that poor mentality, they're going to spend all the money and get themselves in more trouble. And you see this sometimes. They do these documentaries on people who won the lottery, and they're like, I wish I never won the lottery. My life was so much better before I won the lottery. I'm broker now than I was when I started. It's the worst thing that ever happened to me. These are the refrains you get from people. And Yeah, it's like you teach someone how to fish, you feed them for life. I don't believe in eating fish. You teach someone how to grow mangoes, you feed them for life. You give them a mango, you feed them for a meal. You teach them how to grow mangoes, you feed them for life. What has a larger reach and a more permanent reach? That's the idea of like permanence is better. What's more permanent than your eternal soul? You're eternally connected to divinity. Not just in this lifetime, but in every lifetime. What has more of a power to make people love each other and serve each other and fix all the problems of the world? I simply can't think of any more powerful idea in the world of philosophy, in the world of religion, in the world of human thought. I'm making this argument. There is no more powerful idea in the world of human thought. There's never been a more powerful idea. This trumps it. It wins every single debate. As a hypothesis, it's the most beautiful hypothesis. And so you see Prabhupada, he's heroically on a boat, suffering heart attacks. He is thinking strategically. He's fulfilling an order he got 43 years prior. Most of us aren't even 43 years old. He held on to that, this idea, and cultivated it and almost romantically for his entire adult life. Performed incredible austerities at the age of 69. Who jumps on a cargo ship at 69 to go penniless to a foreign country? A country that, doesn't really care what you have to say the moment they start letting your people in the door. And it just so happened, Prabhupada showed up like right in the heyday of the counterculture movement. It was like right in the heyday. So he showed up at the most favorable time in the history of the U.S. for receiving ideas from outside. It was almost providential how well it worked out. Couldn't have worked out better. Such a coincidence. And he shared these ideas that really were his own thought. But they weren't just his own thought. They were ancient ideas, old wine he was putting into a new bottle. And they were powerful a long time ago, and they're just as powerful today. And really the essence of the Hare Krishna movement is we get together, and as a result of getting together, we get closer, just not to each other, but to the prime entity, to the original entity, to the most important thing, to the most important truth. And what is that? That we are part and parcel of the Supreme. And so is everybody else. And this idea destroys exploitation at its root, because everybody becomes your family member. It destroys materialism at its root, because it forces one to look at a deeper reality, something beyond the ephemeral world that surrounds us. And these ideas are beautiful to meditate on. They're powerful. They always have been. They always will be. They're beautiful. And you see here Prabhupada honing in on the most important ideas and then making them into the 7 purposes of ISKCON. So that, 53 years later, 57 years later, we could be looking at them. And we can chase it back, where it comes from, where the ideas come from. And we see, these are amazing ideas. I mean, love God with your whole heart, love your neighbor as yourself. I find that to be a little more primitive. That was Jesus' statement. My Father has 10 commandments, I have 2. Love God with your whole heart, love your neighbor as yourself. I find this statement to be a little more systematic. It's a little more meaty. You can sink your teeth into it a little more. It's a little more philosophical. It provides you a little stronger of a platform. But some of the core principles are there. You're loving your neighbor as yourself because he's also from the same Lord. If you love God, then you have to love your neighbor. You can trace it out. You can see these things. Big ideas in different traditions. Beautiful ideas in different traditions. All right, that's it. We'll do a little kirtan and we'll have some dinner. Thank you so much.